Hi everyone, my name is Chiaki Wilson and I was assigned to talk about competence to consent to a search and seizure. So I figured we would break it down into the 5W questions. So what, who, when, where, and why. Let's just dive right in. So what is search and seizure? Britannica has a pretty good definition of it, and what it essentially says is that search and seizure is practiced by law enforcement officers so that they can gain sufficient evidence to ensure arrest and conviction of an offender. They carry out searches and seizures throughout multiple countries. The United States is one of them. So let's get into the nitty-gritty here. In the United States, we have the Fourth Amendment, and the Constitution, through the Fourth Amendment, protects people from unreasonable searches and seizures by the government. It also is not a guarantee, however, against all searches and seizures, but only those that are deemed unreasonable under the law. So, where did this whole concept of search and seizure even come from? You go back into Britain and English law. They believed that law enforcement officers were allowed to search and seize whatever, whenever they pleased. Their philosophy was that the house of every one is to him as his castle and fortress, as well as for his defense against injury and violence as for his repose. And so, essentially what that means is that they believed that because they were part of one big community, that those who were protecting the community had every right to go in and inspect what was happening in each household and take whatever that the country needed at their own will. However, when we separated from Britain and colonialized here in America, they continued that concept for a little while, except individuals as well as businesses got extremely tired of having law enforcement come in and take whatever they wanted to, or come in whenever they wanted, and they wanted to have a little bit more control over the matter. And so James Otis, which is pictured here, he's a Massachusetts lawyer. He, along with 50 businessmen, went to court to bar the idea of general warrants. Unfortunately, that didn't get approved at that point in time, and so years later, the Fourth Amendment was created by James Madison. So, who can be searched and seized? So, that applies to everyone. However, we do have the competency question of who is competent to consent, and a big part is voluntary consent. And so as long as the individual is inviting law enforcement in to search and seize property, then that is a form of competency. Individuals have the right to refuse a search and seize because of the Fourth Amendment. However, a lot of the time people will consent just because they're worried about the possible outcomes or consequences that will follow if they were to refuse a search and seize. They don't actually have any set consequences for those who do refuse, but just the threat alone deters people from refusing a search and seize. Individuals should be made aware that refusal is allowed. You can't refuse if you don't know that that's actually an option. So that's extremely important as well. In the text, it talks about how Kagehiro had a study where they found that people subjected to police requests for consent are more likely to assert their rights if the request is framed declaratively rather than interrogatively. So to have law enforcement come and tell the individual that they are going to search and seize their property doesn't pan over well for the law enforcement officer versus asking for permission, or at least inquiring in a way that it is interrogative so that it is accepted better by the individual who's about to have their property searched. So when can we use this? A big part of the Fourth Amendment was that they specifically write about how if it's unreasonable, the searches and seizures are prohibited. However, if the law enforcement officers have probable cause, then they have every right to go and search property or seize property. Now, if the law enforcement officers go and perform a search and seizure without probable cause, the fruits or the results of the search are excluded from court proceedings. So there needs to be that process of ensuring that there is probable cause prior to a search and seize, which is a big part of warrants. Okay, so with the Fourth Amendment, as I'm sure you are picking up, criminal proceedings are usually where we're using search and seize or seizures, and so that's the main thing. Law enforcement officers can search houses, cars, businesses, personal property, or seize any personal property that an individual may own, so that they're able to let me get to the next slide. So that they're able to find evidence for these criminal proceedings. And like I mentioned earlier, warrants are big, to be able to find evidence and to be able to go into property of an individual without having to go through them, because once a warrant is created, then the right of refusal is gone, and so the warrant makes it possible for those law enforcement officers to be able to go and search with that probable cause through property that otherwise would have been refused to be inspected by the individual. So as for my discussion question that I came up with, what ways might the mental state or cognitive abilities of an individual affect their competence to consent to a search and seizure, and how should law enforcement and the judicial system account for these factors? Like I said before, a big part of this is voluntary up to a point. Once you have the warrant that is created, you don't really get much of a choice. However, how or what ways can the mental state of an individual affect their competence to be able to voluntarily consent to a search and seizure? Hopefully we can come up with some good ideas. And these are my sources. So, thanks.